Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Legatum Institute, and that includes our live stream audience. We're so delighted that you could be here tonight. My name is Alexandra Musavisadeh, and I'm the director of the Prosperity Index. And for those who do not know the Institute, we are a global think tank, and our mission is to identify and promote the drivers of prosperity around the world. We do this through a whole host of programs run by an amazing cast of directors that include Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anne Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev, as well as Tim Montgomery of The Times, who just published Prosperity for All. The Prosperity Index is our signature publication, which ranks 142 countries in terms of their wealth and well-being, and is now in its 10th year. Our understanding of prosperity goes beyond GDP and includes 8 additional pillars, which range from education and health, to social capital and personal freedoms, to governance and entrepreneurship and safety and security. Our Africa Prosperity Report slices out the data from the Global Prosperity Index and measures and tracks the progress made in the region. It identifies barriers to prosperity and develops policy recommendations based on these findings. With us to discuss some of those findings and to launch our 3rd annual report on prosperity in Africa, we are delighted to have Lord Malloch Brown, the former UN Deputy Secretary General and former head of UNDP. Most of you will be familiar with Mark's distinguished record as a passionate and results-oriented global advocate for African development. Mark started his career at UNHCR and later served in a number of public and private sector roles, including the World Bank under Jim Wolfenson, before being appointed head of UNDP by Kofi Annan in 1999. Mark transformed the UNDP by bringing it to the center of innovation and effective delivery of development assistance. He later on crossed the street and to serve as Kofi Annan's deputy with responsibilities across the entire UN system. Mark was also central to the creation of the UN's Millennium Development Goals, which have affected the lives of millions and which, of course, are a big part of our work here at the Institute. And it is my great honor to welcome Mark here tonight. And by the way, also feel free to tweet. It's hashtag Africa Prosperity. I just wanted to get that in there before we start. But welcome, Mark. We're delighted to have you. Thank you very much.
Well, Alexandra, thank you very much. And thank you for all the work on behalf of all of us that have gone into this report, and Augustine as well. I mean, it is a wonderful, extraordinary index. I think it won't surprise you that as an ex-head of UNDP, I slightly tease Alexandra about its similarities to the UNDP Human Development Index, but she promptly corrects me by pointing out the very important additional things that have been added: the focus on entrepreneurship and on opportunity, the more explicit references to governance and measurements of governance in the index, and that critical thing of social capital. So it is, very much in a sense an index which captures the current development debates in a way that perhaps the HDI did in its time, but now needs to, as the grandfather of such indexes, needs to look to this new generation and could, I suspect, learn some things from what the Prosperity Education Index has done, because the HDI is much more based on health and education, GDP, and a freedom measure, but doesn't get into some of the other things that I've mentioned. But I think what in London at the moment, speaking about a report like this, is in some ways the most refreshing thing of all. It's, for months in this town, it's been almost impossible to have a discussion of development without it coming down to the 0.7 target. And the glory of this report is it's not really about aid. It's about the different performances of African governments to achieve this prosperity. And, for some of them, there is quite a high degree of aid dependence, but for others who are doing incredibly well, there's almost no aid dependence at all as a proportion of the economy. So it kind of just happily moves the debate on to performance and results on the ground. And, congratulations for that, because that's, I think, where we should all be. But I am, in a sense, I think, as a friend, immediate friend of her report, I am going to just pick a little at some of the findings. And, you know, one of them is Rwanda, which does incredibly well in this report, and very properly, because, you know, I during my years at UNDP was one of those who was astonished at the speed with which Kagame's Rwanda came back on indicators like health and education, you know, very quickly overtook the numbers before the genocide and continued year on year to demonstrate real improvements. So in a way, no surprise that in a prosperity index, which is trying to measure in one regard the gap between per capita income and real performance in bringing prosperity to citizens, no surprise Rwanda's success compared to, for example, a much wealthier country of Angola, you know, which ranks 33rd to Rwanda's 8th in the prosperity index. But then you look at the breakdown of Rwanda's indicators and you see that it gets 3rd in the continent for governance. And, you know, that's quite a mouthful to swallow, because even if, like me, you know, I'm actually rather a fan of President Kagame's development achievements, I wince at the government costs of that in terms of the nature of the political regime. So, you know, I do think, you know, the bias towards economic governance at the expense of political governance that I suspect that result reflects is something I think we should pick up as we go on. But I think really in a way what this report so well does is prepares us for the next phase of the Africa story, because we are evidently into a phase where growth rates are moderating in Africa. This happy 5.5% average for the last decade that we've all got so familiar at quoting isn't the story going forward. It's going to be a couple of points off that in the coming years, and that's obviously because of the crisis of commodity prices, which has had a knock-on effect on levels of foreign direct investment, commitments to infrastructure development, etc., etc. West Africa is littered with stalled projects, infrastructure which is not completed, from railways to ports, etc. But it's not just a story of West Africa. You're seeing much the same happening in parts of East Africa and in Mozambique, etc. as well. So this is a region which has got to grapple with a challenge of lower growth. And, you know, what does the report have to tell us about the way forward? And, you know, and the first obvious point is its prosperity index, that GDP is not the only guide to the well-being of its citizens. You can, through good government policy and the provision of things like health and education and opportunity and freedom, make sure your citizens perform much better and have a much better life than GDP alone would suggest. So the power of government and good policy to direct and influence results remain thoroughly unabated. The second issue, though, is, you know, what I think you could call commodities versus complex. The commodities being the Angolas and Nigerias, who are heavily dependent on the export of one unrefined commodity, oil, versus those economies which have had either the opportunity or have worked at building complexity into their economies, particularly making sure that the value added to their exports is more than just one step. It's often a process of having to import other inputs, but the final export that goes out leaves a lot more value added in the economy behind. And so complexity or diversification of an economy is a key finding in this report in terms of equipping yourself for the future going forward. And then I think the next and critical issue is this point of freedom. The assertion in the report, and those of you familiar with the work of the Legatum Institute won't be surprised, the assertion that freedom leads to prosperity. Freer people are more economically successful, and I profoundly believe this. I, at UNDP, you know, rather controversially created a good governance and democracy practice, because, you know, I think freer people are better entrepreneurs, better economic agents, but I also think the freedom to choose your governments leads to more accountable government and therefore a more effective attack on poverty. The next point that I think the report also makes is that we can talk about freedom and we can talk about entrepreneurs and we can talk about economic diversification, but we cannot forget the continuing challenge of basic needs in African economies. Still some 50% of the population are falling short of what you might call the threshold basic needs platform. In Nigeria, for example, the level of sanitation provision is the same as in Afghanistan, despite the fact Nigeria is a country 3 times richer in per capita terms than Afghanistan. And these issues of both dealing with the basic challenges but liberating people to be economic agents of their own destiny and their country's destiny is absolutely critical in a region which is the only one in the world whose population will double in size in little more than a generation. We are not fitting out Africa for the kind of stabilizing population that is now the story in many parts of Asia. We have to kit out Africa, or Africa has to kit itself out rather, for the prospect of high levels of demographic growth. And the challenge in some ways is quite stark. Workers and consumers versus dependents and migrants. And that is a policy challenge which, if we get the answer wrong, will affect not just those on the continent, but in coming generations, Europe and any other region which comes close to Africa. So it's a huge, huge challenge. And therefore, looking forward, what is the model which is going to create the jobs and the opportunity and the real livelihoods for this demographic explosion that Africa is in the midst of? And African sort of businessman, economist, academic, who you may all be familiar with, or many of you, Kingsley Moghalu, who, a Nigerian, has been insisting in a book he's written and in many speeches in London and elsewhere on the industrialization of Africa. A concept which I must say I'm a bit wary of, because I think, in a sense, that is a very 19th century or 20th century solution, and I'm not sure the furnaces of Manchester or is something that one wants to wish on any countries who have this ahead. And if you look to history, in some ways, fixing Africa's agriculture should precede even a discussion about industrialization, and that is both the world of commercial and of small farmers, and the inputs and investments to create an efficient, effective agricultural sector, and one that is able to sustain the land on which it farms, is an absolutely critical current challenge. But with it comes what kind of urbanization is the continent going to embark on? And at the moment, it's a rather giddy and unmanaged one, with an explosion of both city size and the number of cities of significant plus a million population or more. And so the question of quality urbanization, which is right and tailored to the continent and its needs, and indeed to different regions of the continent, is critical. So if I was to sort of think of what are the characteristics which might define Africa as we go forward, it would first be, a appropriate kind of urbanization, which is neither the rigid city planning of other regions, but nor is it the completely unplanned profusion of growth that we are currently seeing. It would be a development where the issue of renewables and off-grid power and generally decentralized solutions to a lot of problems of the continent and of countries would be very large indeed. It would be a development where a modern kind of services sector, where Africa has been a real leader with, just to take the two most totemic names we all know in the sector, of M-Pesa with its mobile banking capability, but also Mkopa with its solar power for which you pay over your mobile phone. This whole idea of mobile commerce, which is so much an African-led and Kenyan-led, particularly, innovation is one that I think we'll see a lot more of as we go forward. And that's not to say there won't be industrialization. I'm involved with a company in Kenya, which is in Nigeria rather, which is trying to fabricate some of the oil plants that at the moment get dragged from Korea or occasionally from South Africa to offshore locations off Nigeria, but we're actually increasing the skills and capability to make them locally and use local content are in place. So I think, you know, the development and the job creation in the continent is very much going to follow its own pattern. There's no, you know, European or American or Asian model from which it's going to borrow wholesale. The countries of Africa will find their own way forward. And just, you know, a final word, which is around the private sector component of this growth, because I do think, you know, you just can't make the sums add up unless you attract large amounts of private capital to the continent, along with the innovation and know-how and business models which make that capital effective, whether it's building out the infrastructure, both energy and transport, and the new urbanization requirements, or finding the investment for agriculture. That is a major capital deficit that can only be plugged by the private sector. But with that prospect of winning investment into Africa comes the need for sound, transparent legal frameworks and redress for the investor who feels that they've been wrongly done by. And I do think that some of the minerals investments in the Congo, the oil and gas in West Africa, there's a sorry story still to be finished of, you know, investments where there was corruption at the core of them, which is going to cast quite a shadow over the investment climate in many parts of the continent in the coming few years, as American investors get dragged into it through their Department of Justice. And, you know, there's a general sort of anxiety about the exposure and risk to African investments, in particularly the commodities sector. But let me say that said, that capital's got to come. There is no way around it. But I think equally as it comes, it is critical that it is capital which is much more long-term patient capital than in the past, much more respectful of local rule of law issues, much more transparent, much more committed to being a good citizen. And that, you know, today still we are seeing governments surprised by, you know, illegal loans that have been taken out by companies that have somehow secured a government guarantee, whether it's the current loan for defense loan in Mozambique, which the VTB Bank, you know, feels it's owed backed by the central government. Some of the issues of the Eurobond borrowings in Ghana. I mention those two countries because both have been poster boys for foreign investment in the continent, and yet both now are struggling with illicit debts that are bearing directly on the country's capacity to meet its obligations to its citizens and sustain growth. So I hope, both on the side of government in the continent, but also on the side of those who step up to meet this private sector investment gap, that there is, you know, a real sense of responsibility and shared commitment to the strategic choice the continent faces of workers and consumers versus migrants and dependency. And, you know, that really is the extraordinary choice, historic choice, that I think we all face in dealing with this remarkable continent that so many of us have either been born in or devoted our working lives to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was brilliant. I don't actually have to go through the report. You did such a fantastic job going through the key findings. But before I introduce our distinguished moderator, Richard Dowden, and the extraordinary panelists, a few words just to go back and pull out some of the things from the report, some of the things you've already highlighted. Thank you, Mark, and you did it brilliantly. It was very well done. But when we look at the prosperity rankings in the African countries, the list is not unsurprising, as you also point to. At the top, we see Africa's richest countries like South Africa and Botswana, while at the bottom we see the poorest, Burundi and the DRC. But actually behind the rankings and beneath the data, we did look and find some really interesting patterns. And looking at the whole list rather than just top to bottom, we found that there was actually not necessarily a link between wealth as measured by GDP per capita and prosperity. So Angola and South Africa, for example, enjoy similar levels of wealth, but Angola ranks among the least prosperous countries in the region, while South Africa among the most. So why are some countries better at converting their wealth into prosperity than others? Are countries over or under delivering across the 8 pillars relative to their wealth? And what can we learn from these prosperity gaps? We found that countries fell into various groupings. One, there are low-income, high-prosperity countries like Rwanda, which you touched on, Mark, characterized by strong government effectiveness, rule of law, and economic diversity. And then you've got your higher-income countries with low prosperity delivery that have undiversified economies and tend to be governed poorly and have developed very unequally, like Angola. So in short, what we found is that good governance and personal freedom and economic diversification enable countries to deliver a lot with a little. Wealth alone does not drive prosperity in Africa, and that's sort of one of the key messages. And this is also a powerful message to policymakers in a time where where the region is facing slower growth and lower commodity prices. So this report demonstrates practical ways in which governments can measure, track, and deliver prosperity with the wealth that they already have. And so now I'd actually like to turn to our distinguished guests and start by introducing our moderator, Richard Dowden. Thank you so much. Richard has spent 40 years working, breathing, and writing about Africa, and is the director of the Royal Africa Society here in London. And to his left is Modupe Ladipo, who is the founding CEO and director of IFINA in Nigeria, and actually also a fellow here at the Legatum Institute. And to her left is Jonathan Rosenthal, who is the Africa editor of The Economist. And to Richard's right, we have David Pilling, who is the Africa editor for the Financial Times and actually just arrived back from Asia after having spent 7 years there for the FT. So welcome, everybody. So thank you very much for coming. We're so thrilled to have you here, and we're looking forward to a robust conversation. And I'm going to hand over the word to Richard. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think I'll start just by asking everybody in turn what their number one, possibly two takeaways was from this year's report. I'll start with Jonathan.
So I was quite struck, firstly, by the one point that's already been made. Excuse me, I've got a frog in the throat, so excuse me. The massive dispersion between sort of some countries' economic levels and then their actual ability to deliver. So again, coming back to Rwanda, with all its warts and all, has done a remarkable job, given that it's still an incredibly poor country. And I suppose the second was just that as you drill into the data, you end up with something of a roadmap, actually. This is not just a kind of index that gets filed in the library shelves and gathers dust, but it's actually something that the policymakers can use. Energy is one of the things that comes up, for instance. As you drill deeper down, and energy kind of drives entrepreneurialism and economic opportunity. And thank you. So if you're saying sort of what are some of the key steps that policymakers can take, here they are. Sort out your energy.
Thanks, Modupe.
So for me, I mean, coming from Nigeria, you think about how in the past 8 or 9 years we've had GDP growth of 7%, 9%, 5%, and how poverty levels have continued to rise. So we've always known that growth has never been inclusive, and we've always wondered what we're going to do in order to really get it, reduce poverty in Nigeria. I was also slightly surprised to see that although South Africa was the #1 country, it only sort of ranked first in one of the sub-indices. And so there's a lot of movement that needs to happen in order to get to the #1 position. I would sort of focus on, at IFINA, we focus mainly on finance, which is access to finance, which is not sort of an indicator that is adequately measured here in prosperity. And I would also think from the gender lens, when you really look at, if we look at that indicator and we look at all those 8 sub-indices and we actually look at it through gender lens, I wonder where different countries will really rank, because in Nigeria we see that women often tend to be more less served formally than men. So that would be my own sort of initial thoughts, that we need to look at gender, and we need to think about the role corruption plays in maybe increasing that prosperity gap and seeing growth that is not inclusive, as well as the complexity of economies that we've talked about.
David.
Well, I know the least about Africa of anyone on this panel, having only started covering it a few months ago and having been in Asia for about 15 years, actually. A couple of things leap out at me. They may be contradictory, so forgive me, but that's the prerogative of a journalist. One is that Africa has certainly underperformed in all sorts of ways. I mean, it's underperformed in converting the growth that it's had into prosperity. Of course, prosperity as defined by the Legatum Institute, and we can agree or disagree or pick holes in or analyse what that means, and that will be the second point that I'll come to in a second. But just to go back to, first of all, the raw GDP, I think we shouldn't be happy with 5.5% growth. I mean, we're not going to have it now going forward, but the population of Africa is growing at 2.5%, 3% a year. And if you look at Asia, from where I've been looking at the world, you need 10% growth, I'm afraid. You need 10% growth for quite a long time to be transformative. That's my number one lesson from Asia, and it's quite a tough one. So you need 10% growth, and then you have to do better at converting that growth into prosperity as defined. And that's the second thing that I get from this report. I'm a big fan of prodding GDP and questioning GDP. I think GDP fails us in all sorts of ways. But an index with 89 variables is also problematic in its own way, because let's say Ethiopia underperforms badly in this index, but I can't really tell you why. I would have to look through all 89 variables. I'm sure I could if I were more patient. But all I know is that it underperforms, and I'm not quite sure why. Somebody said of an index, I suspect an index that they did not like, that tended to reward Scandinavian countries where Norway and Sweden, etc., came top, and countries that might come top in raw GDP, well, like the United States, for example, came lower down. They said, yes, but it is an index of Scandinavianness. So the Legatum Institute index is an index of legatumness. Some countries will be more legatum-like than others, and we may like them to be legatum-like, or we may not, but it may not tell us anything other than our own predilection. So I think we need to just be aware of what it is we're measuring and think about it a little bit. It's not to undermine the index or to criticise the index, but I do think we can't just say this is what prosperity is and let's take that as read. We have to look at it.
I think I've had
my just to clear out of the way a particular question that I have, is Rwanda and Ethiopia are held up as great models at the moment, but although they're economically successful, and I think you're probably quite free to make money there, their political freedom is absolutely, it's got to be near zero. There's no press, there's no free press, there's no, if you stand up and attack the government, you will be in jail fairly quickly, and if you're Rwandan, you flee the country if you disagree with the president. So how, in the sense of the freedom to make money, how does that fit?
Well, again, looking from Asia, I mean, I would like to think that there was a direct link from democracy to growth and economic prosperity. And once countries get better off, I think there might well be. In the early stages, I'm not so sure. I think there is kind of, in a sense, no link. I mean, North Korea, not known for its, regular elections, not known for fantastic economic performance. Philippines is very free in some senses, crazy elections, wacky press. Anyone can be elected. It's doing better, but actually in the Asian context, it's still, despite 10 years of pretty good growth, it's still pretty bad. I mean, it suffers on the downside versus other countries, even, like Malaysia, which isn't necessarily a great success. And the countries that have done pretty well, fortunately or unfortunately, have not necessarily been wedded to democracy in the early stages. South Korea, Taiwan, of course, China now. You know, one may say, and I think you can make a case that, let's say, when you compare India with China, that there is, you know, possibly a very long-term case for India, that India has the robust democratic institutions that will, in the long run, see it good. And that is the long run. We're talking 50 years, maybe 100 years. In the short run, if you were sort of blind and you didn't know where you were going to be born or in what class you were going to be born, in India or China, you would have had to have picked China, because you would have had a much better chance of being, you know, of surviving economically, of being treated half decently, despite what the government was doing in both, you know, and what the formal government was in both countries. So I think it's complicated. I wish I could draw a more simple line, but I don't think I can.
Can you, I mean, Nigeria's got to be the most open country in one way. How does that compare to Ethiopia? Do you rather wish that Nigeria was more like Rwanda? It's very, very, very tightly controlled.
Well, that's an interesting one. You know, we have a population of 180 million, right? So in Lagos State alone, we're almost 20 million residents. And sometimes when you have such a large population, a firm hand in order to sort of maintain discipline and sort of structure is sometimes required. So I think Nigeria, where we sort of fall away, is not really having good governance, and ease of doing business is very restrictive. Safety and security in the last 10 years has become an issue with Boko Haram. And we have freedom of press. We have some form of democracy. We vote, we go and have elections. But in all that time, the level of poverty has been on the rise. So where do we really want to be? Do we want to be like Singapore, where we say, okay, they've had no democratic elections, etc., but very successful economically, etc.? Or do we want to be totally have independence, freedom, but maintain levels of poverty? So I think it's somewhere in between, and we just need to find what works for each country. And I just want to sort of emphasize that Africa is not one homogeneous lot. All of us, there are 50-something countries in there, and everybody's at every country at a different stage. I do not actually think GDP is the way to measure anything, quite honestly. I think that's some way that we need to really think about what really works and how do we really want to show and measure effectively that level of poverty. Both the private sector and government need to be involved in order to sort of drag us to where we really need to be. I think that's something that maybe this doesn't really look at, but when we talk about data, we have to think about data for both sides. What is it telling government? What do government have to put in place? And then what do the private sector also have to do in order to enable Nigeria to become really the giant that we say we are? Because after all, we are the biggest economy in all of Africa, and yet we're ranked 15, 16, 17 down here. In any sort of index that looks at ease of doing business or other things, we don't have a good ranking. But of course, if it's corruption, we're way up there. So that's where our ranking is. So I think we need to understand that role better and really sort of minimize that in order to move forward.
Do you think the extended family is important in Africa in protecting people, large families in hard times, and actually, or then when one person in the family becomes successful, and this has been my experience, they then almost have to pull away from the family because the rest of the family all want a piece. Even your cousins, many times removed, what we would call, can lay claims to you for school fees, for medical. Is that a problem? Does the family hold Africa back, or does it provide great support in tough times, or a mixture of both?
A mixture of both. I mean, if we look at from the access to finance point of view, when we do a demand side survey every 2 years, and when we ask people, have you taken a loan? They say yes. Where did you borrow money from? It's friends and family. So friends and family are the main source of revenue, loans, and borrowing, protection. If you have no income, where do you get your income from? Friends and family. If you want to get a loan, friends and family. So you can imagine the kind of role and as you said, the kind of pressure that puts on any individual that is really very well-to-do, or even not so well-to-do, but more well-to-do than your extended family. So they offer us, it's helpful in one way, But on the other side, it's also can be quite draining. So we need to sort of look at the positive sides of those things and then think about how do we minimize the kinds of pressure that it comes to bear on prosperous friends and family, and really sort of minimize, extend the jobs to other people. Because in Nigeria, we currently have 26 or 27 million unemployed people, mainly youth. So those people rely on their family. We don't have a welfare system. So those people rely on their family to really sort of be their welfare system. So we'll need to develop welfare, we'll need to get jobs, we'll need to diversify the economy, and then we're going through a particularly bad patch where oil prices have collapsed, and we do not have a diversified economy, and that takes lots of years. Not tomorrow, we're not going to just plant and then start harvesting. So how do we get that up and running? And then major issue is no energy. We don't have constant power. So how do we get that working as well? But the extended family sort of acts as a bank, as an insurance company, you know, as all the things that in the developed country you would have those systems in place. So we really need to look at that from that point of view, how we're going to improve that. But it has its benefits.
Jonathan, yeah.
I'd love to come back to you in a minute and ask you a question about financial inclusion and technology and women. But if we just jump back to this comparison with Ethiopia, and I mean, I'd like to slightly prick that bubble of Ethiopian performance because it is still an incredibly poor country. If you look at these estimates and the various ones of kind of the African middle class, and even at a very kind of low definition of middle class, Ethiopia is still sort of, at the lowest definition, sort of 2 or 3% of people come out as anything that we would vaguely call middle class. This is a country that's facing mass hunger because of drought. So we it really is at a very, very low base. And I mean, the cynical part of me thinks that to some extent government policy is not aimed at keeping people poor, but it is certainly not aimed at encouraging the kind of growth of a kind of messy, noisy, politically demanding middle class of the sort that we would all like in this room. It still keeps tight control of banks, of telecoms. Internet and telephone penetration are still very much lower than in many other parts of the continent. So that kind of top-down Chinese model that a lot of other African leaders now aspire to is quite stifling, not just of political rights, but also of kind of economic rights and prosperity more generally. But that said, I mean, I think this discussion does kind of raise the broader discussion that countries like Nigeria, like Kenya, that we would want to succeed, these kind of messy, noisy political places, I mean, have generally not been performing quite as well as we'd like. And it'd be good to talk some more about perhaps sort of what some of those issues are. But and this, I guess, comes back to financial inclusion and I suppose your question of the family. Because, I mean, I'm an optimist in the sense that I think the technology is changing a lot of this. That even your sort of dirt poor farmer in Ethiopia who has this, sort of heavy-handed state leaning down on them, is reaching the point, even though, as I say, phone penetration is still relatively low. It's probably about half the population now, and correct me if anyone's got a better statistic, have now got phones and therefore access to information from sort of wider than just their village and family and the local kind of party bosses. So I'm kind of optimistic that is transformative. And when one starts looking at other things like, I think your point about the family, that very difficult to be the kind of tall poppy in a sea of poverty. But when you talk to people who are sort of either using or kind of setting up these kind of mobile money, mobile wallet type things, it's a lot easier now to send grandma some money that will pay for little brother and sister's school fees on a phone, and no one knows she's got it but you and her. So it's not going to the other 10 cousins to pay for God knows what gambling debts or booze or whatever it may be. So I'm quite optimistic that a lot of these barriers are being overcome.
Just on the middle classes, I just collected the various versions of middle class. I've got a Standard Bank in 2014. It says the African middle class is 7.6 million, earning between $23 and $115 a day. McKinsey's 2008, 15.7 million earning $55 a day. The OECD 2014, 32 million people earning between $10 and $100 a day. And the African Development Bank, 327 million earning $2.2 a day. So take your pick of what the African middle class looks like. Let's open it up to questions. Who would like to ask a